How many of you have been asked the dreaded question of what are your plans after graduation? Okay, relatable, yes, good. How many, keep your hands up if you knew exactly what you were going to do after graduation. Okay, that's good, that's impressive because can't relate to that. I didn't know what I wanted to do after my PhD. What I did know was that I was likely not going to be and remain in academia. And I'm certainly not the only one in that particular scenario. What we know is that globally there are an oversupply of PhD graduates and a shrinking number of faculty positions. And while this data is from 2011, this trend is still very much current. And in the US, we know that last year we've produced an all-time high of PhD graduates at 57,000. So you have 57,000 PhDs awarded and you have 5,000 faculty positions. So what does that mean? That means that if you're not counting postdocs, there are only enough open faculty positions for 1 out of 10 PhDs that are awarded. And so as you can imagine, many more PhDs are considering non-academic careers. One thing I do want to address is that generally in academia, this thought of transition out of academia is thought to be giving up or a step down. And I want to offer that it is just an alternative and it's not for everyone, but it is something that is available. And that is the route that I went. I went down the alternative route. That's why I'm here. And so what I will talk to you about, my name is Merisa Nisic. I work in healthcare communications. I'm based in New York City. And I've made this transition, obviously. And so I'll take you through 5 things that I've learned in the transition. And my experience obviously is coming from someone who has a PhD, but I would say that these 5 lessons apply to any students. So with that said, we'll dive right in. Lesson 1, making a career switch takes work. And I know that sounds very obvious, but after you finished your PhD, you've done this long, arduous journey, and you think, okay, finding a job is gonna be easy in comparison. That is not the case. And I think that overconfident mindset of thinking that your knowledge will be all that you need and will, make you stand out is something that can actually hold you back. And what ultimately happens is that even PhDs have to do the same process as everyone else when it comes to this. And so I will kind of walk you through what I found to be the key differences between academia and industry, and where I would say I had a steep learning curve was this very first one, so mindset. In academia, I would say in general, there's an individual mindset. I think your research becomes your life. It's your project and you're planning your experiments and you're presenting your research. And generally you are also recognized on a more individual level, I would say. And that is in contrast to industry, where it's much more collective mindset. And so there's more emphasis on teamwork, on collaboration. There's generally multidisciplinary teams. You're not in a room with full scientists. So this is a major difference for me. I think at first there's a bit of loss in this, because you're like, oh, you've lost ownership, right? Because it used to be your papers and your project, but I think that eventually for me became a liberating idea, because my successes and my failures weren't mine alone to carry. So it was with a team that also took responsibility for what the turnout was. So if you look at it in that way, it becomes a little bit easier, because I know academia can be a little bit hard on the mental health as well. So in that sense, the next difference, professional development. So as many of you know, career progression in academia very much depends on your publications, where you're publishing, impact factors, teaching, securing grants, versus in industry, professional growth mostly depends on impact, how your projects are, the outcome of those projects, your skill acquisition, and also if you are showing leadership. And that could be through mentoring someone who's junior or taking the lead on a project. So those are the things that generally will propel you on the industry side of things. Pace and flexibility. This is a big one. So in academia, research timelines, hours, I would say are generally flexible and self-directed. You have more freedom to explore. And generally there is a larger threshold for failure. I would argue that a PhD is mostly about failing, but that was my experience anyway. Versus industry, it's much faster paced. There's strict deadlines. It's a much more structured environment, and there's defined work hours versus, again, my PI didn't care whether I came in at 5 a.m. or midnight, as long as it got done. Versus in industry, the bane of my existence is every Friday putting in hour for hour what project I worked on for what client, so that could be billable. So it's a very different environment. I will say one thing, the flexibility is great, and sometimes I miss that about academia. I think though, because it is self-directed and we are overachievers, generally people who pursue a PhD, I think that could get us into a culture of overworking. And so I find that, there's a lot more limits in the industry side versus you pushing yourself. For example, I was in the lab sometimes 16 hours a day, and I'm at my job at 8 hours. So, I think it really just depends on what you're looking for. Communication style. So again, academia, you're writing publications, you're writing posters. I think in general it's a more formal means of communication. And in terms of audience, you're generally communicating with people who are very knowledgeable. They might be in your field, but in general have a higher knowledge of science, and you probably, presenting to peers. And so there's a lot of jargon, I would say, and there's an assumption that people know what these things mean. Versus in industry, I think the emphasis is more about being clear and concise, and generally distilling down to its most, I would say, fundamental, so that you can make your point to a very wide audience. So, sometimes there's not a scientist in the room, right? And so it could be an art person, like on my teams. Some people are creatives, they do art, but you have to explain the science to them so that they can make the art, right? So it really depends, and it's, again, a lot more concise, I would say a lot more colloquial, because you are trying to reach a wider audience than in academia. Goal orientation. As you know, PhDs take years, so I think, research goals are generally long-term, and then there's someone after you that takes over your project, and on it goes. And so I think because of that, there is more room for exploration and, again, risk-taking. I think obviously academia allows for more failure, because that is the job, is to discover and figure out if things are working or if they aren't. In industry, it's much more results-oriented. So there are meeting goals, again, those strict deadlines that I keep mentioning, and then everyone's working to get to a very concrete point, and all of the things are factored into that. How long this might take, how long this might take. And so it's a very kind of structured, I would say, way of working, and everything needs to ladder up to what the business objectives are. So every year, a company will come together, these are our objectives for the year, and everyone is going to be working to be able to, at the end of the year, say, we delivered on X, Y, Z. So difference in that kind of goal orientation. What I will say is that in both of these, in both academia and industry, just stressing how important it is to have both a good PI and a good manager, because I think you will be able to achieve your goals, whatever they are, more so if you have someone that is supportive, if you have a PI who understands you, who's willing to work with you, who's very knowledgeable, who, can throw opportunities at you, know what you're good at, challenge you. And the same with a manager in industry. They'll push you, they know where you need to work. They're actively invested in developing you versus someone who isn't a good PI or a good manager. And there are people who are very smart, but they are not good managers. And I would say the very same for PIs. So I just want to stress that if you're choosing a lab, definitely make sure that you have a great relationship with the PI, and the same for industry. I think it's very, very important. And this is the last difference that I'll talk about: compensation and job security. So I don't think it's any news to anyone that academia is lower compensated than industry positions, and that there's that competitive grant chasing in order to keep your research running. And we know, I mentioned earlier, that those tenure track positions are hard to come by, and they're even harder to secure. And in contrast, industry, the salaries are high, the funds are there. It's just a matter of whether the corporation wants to allocate those funds for whatever it is that is their objective for that time period. And in general, I would say job security for industry depends on how the company is doing. For example, Pfizer manufactured millions of COVID vaccines, and then the pandemic was over. Countries didn't want to buy anymore. People didn't want to get vaccinated. So they had to lay off thousands of their employees because they were at a loss. So in that case, your job security is at risk because the company is not doing so well. So that's just one example of that, which takes us into lesson number 2. You can do so much with a PhD, and I think in being in academia and not being very exposed, I think you think your only option is a postdoc. And I know many people finish their PhD and by default go into a postdoc. And universities, I would say, don't generally offer very much career or professional development for graduate students. At least that was my experience. And so it's not a shock that that's what we think, that there is only one route. But I actually found that to be otherwise when I attended a career fair. And so I think, it's exactly what you said, Vega, like open yourself up and and I think when I went to the career fair, this is my shameless plug for NYU's What You Can Be with a PhD. So this was a PhD career fair that I attended my last year of my PhD. It's the largest PhD career fair in the US. It's hosted by NYU's School of Medicine, and it happens every 2 years. When I went, it was in person, but now I'm happy to see that it's virtual, and the top institutions come, as well as just a number of different industries. And it's not just for US students. There were students from 19 different countries that can attend, and the attendance, this was outdated, it's 2021, but it was a little bit less than 2,000 attendees. So the last one that happened was in 2023. So that means that next year will be the next iteration of this. So highly recommend that anyone who's doing a PhD or anyone who's interested in a PhD to check it out, because the sooner you know what your options are and kind of can explore what others are doing or what may interest you, I think it's just more beneficial. And it's not very, I don't think it was very expensive. I went in person, it was $40. I think it's probably cheaper now because it's virtual. So they try to keep the costs very minimal because it is students. So highly recommend. But what essentially the career fair made me realize was there's 3 buckets of where you can go, outside of your, once you're done with school. So it's academia, which we know the most because we're there. So won't spend too much time there. Then you can end up either in the nonprofit government sector or in industry and business, for profit, or you start your own business. And so I won't spend too much time in the academia bucket because, again, I feel like we are most familiar in this bucket. You can be a PI, you can go on to be a secondary educator, etc. There was a lot of interesting people who came to speak from the nonprofit government sector, and some of the roles that came to speak they were regulatory affairs professionals, they worked in public health and analyzed public health data. They could have been a testing specialist, either public health, genetics. So, and again, you can always continue research in the government sector as well. So there are government programs that will allow you to do research as well. And then there's the last bucket, the industry and business bucket. So this was interesting too, because I didn't know some of these jobs existed. I didn't know that you can go on and get your JD and become a patent lawyer, and you can be involved in intellectual property. So this is an active field, because as discoveries are happening, you need to protect them, and you need scientists to be behind that. You can go into the business of science, so investment analysts are involved there. You can go into science writing and communications, that's where I ended up. You can go into sales, again, entrepreneurship, and obviously you can do research in industry. I think one of the nice things about doing research in industry is you don't have to worry about the funding. The not nice things is that you don't get to decide what you're really doing research on. So, there's always a pro and a con, right? Which takes us to lesson 3. Let me go back for a sec. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list, and there are more things that you can do than this. But even seeing this much, I was exhausted and overwhelmed at the career fair, because it's like, okay, I went from postdoc, one thing, to now I have this list of 25 things. What do I want to be when I grow up, right? So it could be very overwhelming. And so my lesson 3 is you need to pause and reflect before you job hunt. I think it's important to ask yourself, what's important to me? What am I good at? What are my skill sets? Where do my strengths lie? Because I think that will help you determine which way to go in. And generally, when you're looking at your skills and trying to take stock of what all you have to offer, we have 2 buckets, and many of you probably know this already. We have our hard skills, our technical skills. So under that, there tend to be ones that are more specialized, and I think those are more falling into your research. So generally, you're not going to use these again. If you're transitioning out of academia, you're not going to be asked to use an electron microscope. And then there are hard skills that are a little bit more applicable. So those could be technical writing or programming. So those you could possibly use in an industry job in the future. And then there are the non-technical soft skills. And so these you can apply to any job that you would be pursuing, and they're generally referred to as your people skills. And the importance of soft skills is they're very important, and I would argue actually more important than your technical skills. So I'll take you guys through the 5 that I'd like to highlight, and many of you are probably familiar with them, so I'll go pretty quickly. Problem solving, time management, oral and written communication skills, collaboration, and adaptability. And if you've done a PhD or you go on after your bachelor's to do a master's, you have these things. You have these things in space, but you just need to be able to highlight them. One thing I will just mention, in addition to these, if you can demonstrate leadership as well, then I think that will separate you from the rest of the crowd. So even if it's not leadership, maybe that you've had particularly as a student, right? Maybe you haven't had that experience there. If you have a part-time job, if you have a hobby, if you are volunteering, there's something that you can use to demonstrate leadership. So if it's initiating a passion project through BHFF, that is your way to demonstrate that you are a leader. So it doesn't have to just be within your academic career to be able to highlight these things. And also, don't underestimate your current or former connections, because anyone who's worked with you, they know what you're good at, and they know how you work, and they can give you feedback. I think the best thing you can ever do is ask for feedback, because you can never go wrong. You could always improve upon something. And so they can help you identify and highlight your skills as well. And they can possibly even vouch for your experience and your skills. So whether that's a letter of recommendation or even offering you a referral if you are interested in a role in their company. So don't underestimate the people you know. And then if you don't know anyone, reach out to a complete stranger. I've done this, it works. It actually works a lot better than you think it does. So I think when you, obviously that was an exhaustive list, but the idea would be to narrow down to 2 to 3 jobs that are interested to you, and then to reach out to people in those roles and just ask for 15 minutes of their time. You know, how did you get here? What was your journey? You know, how did you prepare? Do you have any advice for me? Anything they're really willing to share. And generally, I found that people are very open to sharing, obviously as long as you're respectful and don't don't assume that they have to give you their time. People are, I found, to be very open to sharing. And I think people who have already transitioned from academia to industry are kind of like your secret weapons, because they've already did the transition. They know how it goes. They are able to offer you, you know, any kind of advice that they may have. And I think having these conversations was like really great for me to stay hopeful and like almost life affirming, because I think job hunting gets you down. You get repeated rejections, imposter syndrome strikes in, like, should I even be applying to this job? There's burnout, because I feel like job searching is a job on its own, like that's taking on a part-time job. And when talking to these other people, you realize that there's a lot of, you know, talking to another human and realizing that there's a commonality in the journeys or in the experiences you've had. I think it just makes you more hopeful and makes you just realize you're not alone in this, that there's other people who have also struggled and probably had the same experiences. So it's important to talk to other humans. And speaking of humans, that takes us to lesson 4, humans hire humans. And this is just to say that your professional network is, and you know, networking and your relationships professionally are the #1 thing that you'll need to get a job. I would argue, in my experience, the current role that I have now was offered to me at dinner. For my very first manager out of grad school, her and I stayed connected even after I went to another company, and we would get monthly dinner when she was in town. And we just happened to meet up. She said she got promoted to the head of the department. She would like for me to work for her. That's how that happened. So I think it's very important, even if you're still not working with people, to keep relationships and not just go to people when you just need something. It's more just an authentic, you know, relationship sharing, etc. And that's just not my personal experience. That's what is found. This was from a recent Nature survey, and they looked at 1,000+ hirers globally, 77 countries, and they too prefer to hire through personal networks. That's where they go to recruit. That's how they hire. You know, there are the LinkedIn's in there. There are the job boards, but it's very different when you can say for yourself, this person can do the job. Like, you know the person, you know their work ethic. I think it's just, I think it's more, well, personal. And so now that you've taken stock of your skills and you've figured out what you did well, and you've had those informational interviews with other people, how do you kind of transition to prepare for the transition? You research the company, obviously, make sure that it's a good role for you. You do those informational interviews, but you do it with people from within the company now. It doesn't necessarily have to be that role, but it could be, just to figure out what the company culture is like. What's a day in the life for someone in that company? What are the policies like? What are the days, honestly, what are the days off like? Are you getting what you need for sick time, whatever it is? So you can do that as well. And then tailoring your CV and all other applications, or all other materials for each application. So I guess before I get into tailoring for the application, one larger point I would make is that unlike an academic CV, which seems like an exhaustive list of every publication you've ever published, poster, anything, a industry resume is generally 1 page. And again, we're focused on those skills and how you can demonstrate based on your experience, how you can deliver on those skills, deliver on that job. So generally, I would say relegate those publications to the end, but more likely I would recommend removing them all together, because it's just less relevant than the other things that you're trying to get across. But if you do have an application, definitely tailor to each application that you're doing. And the way you can do that is by playing buzzword bingo. And so essentially this is going line by line of the job application and picking terms that are used in the job posts and then using them verbatim in your resume and your cover letter, because humans hire humans, but humans aren't seeing your resume first. It's these applicant tracking systems, it's these AI tools. So because of that, you want to get through by using those buzzwords, because otherwise you're going to be filtered out as not qualified, but that's not the case. It's just that you haven't played the game correctly. And another pro tip that I would say is don't look to be able to deliver on every single bullet of a job, because if you do, you're already overqualified for that job. So that's something that I did in the beginning. I was like, oh, I don't meet these 3 bullets, I can't do this job. And now when I think of it, I was like, yeah, because you need to grow into this role. That's where you're going to grow, versus, oh, I can't apply for it. And an interesting stat that I came across is that women will apply to a job when they have met 90% of the criteria, whereas men will apply to a job when they've met as little as 60% of the criteria. So ladies, please apply. That's what I'll say to that. And then the last is practicing for the interview. So I think my note here is practice for questions outside of science as well, because in industry, they more want to know about your workplace behavior. For example, I've been asked questions like, tell me a time that you failed, tell me a time you've improved efficiency on your team. Questions that reflect how you handle situations. So less about the science, more about you, which I know those are the harder questions that nobody really wants to answer, but that's what you will be asked. And another thing is bring your questions to the interview. I think that's so important, and that comes from the first step, which is research the company, because the thing that I hate about sometimes interviews, if someone will come and they have no questions, it's like there's really nothing that's that you're interested in knowing, and I think even if you know the answer because you've done this and this, ask anyway, because they don't know what they don't know. So then they'll just think that you're not interested, versus, oh, this person had great questions, and I think that always reflects well, at least on me when I'm interviewing people. So definitely ask questions, because you've already done the work, and you should show that. And that comes to lesson number 5. Your next job is not your last job. I know probably your first job out of your PhD doesn't tick all the boxes. I started as a fellow, so it didn't think that I would go from PhD into a fellowship, but that was that. So yeah, I might not tick all the boxes, but I think it's important to just be persistent in gathering information. And what I mean by that is, in that role that you're in currently, what do you like? What don't you like? And definitely pay attention to what you don't like, because it's as important to know what you don't like as it is to know what you like, because then the next role you'll be able to start limiting things and start finding things that are more of a fit for you. And yeah, that will hopefully you'll end up in a role that is more of a perfect fit for you in the next one. But basically, stay hopeful. I know that that whole process and the transition in general can be a little bit overwhelming. There is obviously rejections. It can be overwhelming. There is burnout, imposter syndrome. All of that is very real. But yeah, I think that if you stay hopeful and you do the process and work the process, you will find something that fits you. And so those are my 5 lessons, and thank you so much for listening, and I will take any questions you may have.